assessment, and help on a more environment-friendly solution at lower cost. We discuss in this episode of The Chiefs. And joining us tonight is UP Marine Science Institute Director Dr. Laura David. Dr. David, welcome to The Chiefs.
Magandang gabi po. Salamat sa pag-imbita.
Good evening din po.
Now, I mean, let's start off with, of course, Yusek Antiporda has already apologized to the entire UP community. Ano pong response ng UP at ng Marine Science Institute doon?
Matagal na po naman na may working relationship ang DNR at ang UP at masaya po kami na magpapatuloy na yun ngayon.
Ano po kaya nangyari at medyo napag-initan kayo? Dahil lang po ba yun doon sa pinopose ninyo na sana ay mga bakawan na lang or mangrove ang inilagay sa Manila Bay sa halip na dolomite sand? Yun po ba yun?
Sa totoo lang po, ang Institute of Biology ang nagtulak ng bakawan ng gamitin sa iba't ibang lugar ng Manila Bay. Hindi po ang Marine Science
hindi
Institute.
kayo?
Hindi po. Pero pinapasigundahan po namin yun. Tama rin naman yun. Ang nilabas po namin ay yung sewage ang #1 problem ng Manila and that has to be addressed.
I see.
Professor, I mean, let's go back to, I mean, let's talk about Manila Bay. I mean, yung mamaya na yung kay Yusek Antipoda. What people really care about here is Manila Bay. But from the very start, we were trying to ask the DNR. Let's start with the baseline. Ano ba pagkakaintindi natin sa Manila Bay? I know you're an expert on these things, but give us the layman's history first. Ano ba ang Manila Bay dati? And when we talk about what it should look like, should we start with the discussion of what was it before? What was it in its most pristine state?
Actually, Sir Robbie, pag kausap ko yung mga estudyante kong baguhan, ang tanong ko sa kanila, tara, mag-field tayo sa Manila Bay. Ang unang reaction nila is, ayaw nila kadiri, ganyan. And then I take them out on a boat and we go out and they see it's a very, very beautiful place, full of life. And then they change their mind. And when we get back home, they say, okay, our perception of Manila Bay has changed. It's beautiful. It has, and then I tell them the results of the water quality of the samples we got, and I show them a very high coliform and a very high heavy metal, and they're like, again, no. So ganun ang perception I think ng tao. It changes depending where you are, what you do. And therefore, yung priority of cleaning it up also changes because iba-iba yung perception ng kung ano yung dapat unahin.
So speaking of depending on where you are, kasi kahit kinukwento mo yan, I'm having a hard time myself picturing. So pagka sinabi mong nag-field trip kayo sa Manila Bay, where exactly did you bring them? Baka naman sa beach sa Bataan mo din nila rather than Rojas Boulevard. Where exactly do you bring them na namamangha sila?
We start at Rojas Boulevard and we go all the way to Corregidor Island and back. So they see the spectrum.
Yes. Okay, napag-uusapan na rin lang yung pollution doon. Hindi ba yung pollution ay doon lang mismo sa Manila Bay kung saan dumadaong ang mga barko? Or does it extend all the way to Corregidor? Because I've been to Corregidor and I'm sure you have been too, no? Kay Robbie. But mukhang malinis naman ang tubig sa gawin yon. So when you say Manila Bay, hindi ho ba yun lang yung pinaka-coastline dyan sa may Rojas Boulevard, extending all the way to coastal in Cavite and then to sa Paseco toward the north, no? Hindi ho ba yun lang yun?
Hindi po. Actually, the Manila Bay is about 2,400 square kilometers. Ang lawak-lawak niya. So it spans everything from Cavite, Manila, Bulacan, Bataan, So lahat yun.
Okay.
Oo, so ang
So
laki-laki
lahat
niya.
yun, okay. Pero hindi naman lahat yon marumi. Do you get to a point sa laot na malinis na siya?
Depende po
Ano
sa
ba yun?
tawag niyo. Depende po kung ano ang perception niyo ng dumi. If it's just floating trash, then yes, it's very near Manila Bay. But if it's water quality, medyo malayo-layo. Meron pa rin delikado sa water quality. And then if you talk about microplastics, it goes all the way to corridor.
Oh,
Good,
So,
good
it
so
depends.
malawak. Okay.
evening,
So
Professor.
malawak palang damage. Okay, yeah. Go ahead,
So,
Tami.
Professor, it's possible na iba-ibang sections ng bay pwedeng hiwa-hiwala yung cleanup. Kasi sinasabi ng DENR, the water quality, as far as they're concerned, dito sa portion ng Manila, portion ng Manila, yung talagang pinaka-polluted, yung malapit sa Manila. So that area, sabi nila malaki na daw ang improvement ng water quality. Kaya nga naglagay na daw sila ng ganyan daw para in preparation for a time na pwede nang mag-swimming ang mga tao. Tama ba yung assessment nila?
Let's take it in parts. The first half is malinis na ba siya? If you may apat po kasing puntos yung malinis. May nakikita ba kayong basura? May naaamoy ba kayo? Pwede na ba siya pangisdaan? Pwede na ba siya panglangoyan? So yun po yung 4 stages. So sa gawi po ng trash na visible, saka sa gawi po ng amoy, ang laki na talaga ng pinagbago ng Manila Bay. Malaki na nagawa ng, hindi lang po DNR, lahat po ng 13 ahensya na nakalagay sa Mandamos. Marami na silang na-contribute. So nakita nyo, meron talagang pagbabago and that's good. Kaya lang po, yung perception nga na malinis na, hindi kasi tinitignan yung laman ng tubig. At so pag ang tinanong mo is, papalangoyin mo ba apo mo doon? Papabayaan mo ba magtampisaw ng 3 oras? Yun po, ang sagot pa rin ay hindi. Kasi mataas pa rin ang coliform niya.
Are we talking about the entire bay? Or yung sinabi ko lang na area? Yung pinaka-problematic, yung malapit dito sa opisina namin. Yung malapit sa port area. Are
Opo,
we talking about that area?
Yes, we're talking about near Rojas Boulevard.
Yes.
Yeah, definitely. Mataas ang coliform.
So it's possible, ulitin ko yung tanong ko, it's possible na by section yung cleanliness. Kasi meron din namang portion dun sa Las Piñas, yung habitat, di ba? Marami na doon mga mangrove and it's spreading. Ang ganda-ganda na ron.
Opo, tama.
Yes. Saka yung sinabi nga ni Lucci sa Bataan, malinis naman yung nakapunta na rin ako doon eh. Malinis naman around corridor, nakakapag-swimming mga tao.
Yes,
So pwede na siyang by section. By
Opo.
section.
So, by section po. Opo. Kaya, ang tinutulak po ng Marine Science Institute at ng College of Science ng UP Diliman ay magkaroon ng iba't ibang monitoring sites. Hindi lang isa. Para masabi nyo kung ano pa ang kailangan gawing intervention ng management sa specific na lugar.
Okay.
So kanina, nabanggit ninyo na sewage ang inyong pinuna. No? Yung Bakawan, you agree with it, pero yung sewage ang gusto nyong punahin. Ano po sana ang plano na akma sa kalagayan ngayon ng Manila Bay in terms of the sewage treatment? Kung ano man ang gagawin doon. Yeah.
Kailangan po talaga ng seryosong wastewater management at wastewater treatment plant. Kasi po nung ginawa ang wastewater treatment ng yung sewage system ng Manila, ang projection po nun ay about 4 million people. Lagpas-lagpas na po tayo doon. So hindi talaga nakakayanan. Kahit na dumaan ka sa sewage system, hindi na nakakayanan ng sistema. At marami, hindi nga dumadaan sa sewage system, which is even worse.
Yes.
So we estimated it's only about 20% is actually cleaned up. The rest, the 80%, just goes through a sewage, untreated.
Yes. Ang bansang yes.
Professor, as a visioning exercise, I really like yung sinabi mo 4 stages or at least 4 phases that people can monitor. Nakikita mo ba, naaamoy mo ba, may bumabalik ba ang buhay dyan, pwede ba magtampisaw o lumangoy dyan. But we're saying that ideally, if we invest properly and if we do things right, people can really imagine a time when Rojas Boulevard, Manila Bay, all parts of Manila Bay will be swimmable and actually teeming with life?
May dalawa pong historical areas na ganyan. Ang Mississippi po sa US at ang Moreton Bay sa Australia. Sobrang dumi na po dati na lumiliyab na siya in certain parts kasi may langis, may tambak, ganun na po kagrabe. And yet, na-revive nila. Moreton Bay now is one of the cleanest, beautiful, and high-end living sa Australia. But it took them a lot of years and a lot of persistent funding, persistent research in order to be able to do that. But it's possible.
But how long and how much?
Well, for Moreton Bay, it was $50 million for about 10 years. But they were able to revive it from ayaw tumira ng mga tao doon. That's the lowest type of housing that you can find. Now to it's so high end that it's hard to buy there because it's so expensive.
But now on the other side of it, when UP Bio recommends Bakawan, and as you said, in-endorsed nyo yun, bakit yun ang recommendation? Is that trying to bring it back to what it was before, or hindi necessarily Bakawan yan dati? It just makes sense that ito yung pwedeng gawin dyan. Saan po nang gagaling yan, and what is the main thinking there kung bakit Bakawan?
So tatlo po ang gamit ng Bakawan. Ang una-una po ay nakakapag-help doon mag-filter ng tubig. So napapalinis niya, no? It's a filtration from land to sea. Pangalawa po, ito ay bahay ng mga isda, lalo na yung mga bagong panganak. So kung gusto niyo dumami yung isda sa Manila Bay, kailangan mas marami pang Bakawan. Pangatlo po, at nakita natin to noong Haiyan, nakatulong siya sa storm surge, no? Yung mga barangay na nasa likod ng malalaking forest ng mangrove, na spare sila. So ito po yung advantage ng Bakawan. Ngayon po, saan niyo siya itatanim? Dapat kung saan din historically meron. Kasi pag wala siya doon, naturally, sabihin, hindi siya mabubuhay doon. So, a huge part of Bulacan, a huge part of Cavite, small parts of, say, Baseco, and the end of Pasig River at the very end, yun, may mga Bakawan pa actually yung maliliit eh. So, pwede yung palaguin at matubuin ng mas marami. Ngayon po, yung mismong Rojas Boulevard, that's already a reclaimed area. Yes. So kung ano pa yung historical Bakawan doon, matagal na siyang natabunan. So pag nagtanim kayo doon ngayon, hindi na siya appropriate. Mamamatay din yung Bakawan.
So appropriate ba na gawing beach yun? Kasi yun ang balak, di ba? Kaya nga naglagay ng white sand.
Ano po yan eh, priority, di ba? Kung mayaman ng Pilipinas, okay naman lahat itong gusto nating gawing pagandahin ng Manila Bay. Lahat gawin na natin. Pero alam naman po natin, limited ang funds. So you have to prioritize. And according to the Mandamus, which was agreed upon by a lot of agencies, it was really water quality first. So in that sense, the Dolomite, it doesn't contribute to the betterment of the water quality.
But does it damage? Does it do more harm?
Actually po, very limited din naman yung magiging impact niya. No? It's very near that shore. Eventually, pag naus-us na siya, hahalo na yun sa sariling sediment ng Manila Bay. So the engineering term is the solution to pollution is dilution. So since ang laki-laki ng Manila Bay, ang liit lang naman ng area, if you think of it in a big term, parang wala siyang effect. Pero on the very nearby, on a small scale, right next to it, of course, it can also damage. Kasi kahit na ano namang tabunan mo ng sediment, mamamatay.
But it's an aquatic mineral, ano? Yan ang sabi, na it's an aquatic mineral actually. Saka ginamit na daw yan, even sa ibang bansa na to create beaches. Yun na nga, sinabi nyo, influent places, kahit sa Paris.
Opo. Ano po kasi, bawat isang lugar, iba yung hampas ng alon. Dapat po, appropriate yung materials dun sa hampas ng alon. Kasi kung hindi, ma-erode din yun. So, for example po sa Boracay, banayad ang alon, kaya very fine yung iyong sediment. Pero pag pumunta ka ng Batanes, ang lakas-lakas ng hampas ng alon, wala dong sand. Puro bato-bato. So dapat po yung ilalagay na materyales, appropriate siya dun sa behavior ng waves, ng wind dun sa lugar na yon. Pag mali po, ma-erode din siya, mauustos din siya eventually. In some areas, 1 year lang, nawawala na. In some areas, 5 years, tumatagal. Pero eventually, nasisira siya.
Actually,
So
Professor,
ito masisira.
there's another
So ito
issue.
masisira ito, no? Kasi, ang
hindi po
lakas din
malayo.
ng hampas ng alon doon eh.
Hindi po malayo kasi tama kayo, malakas ang hampas doon. Saka nagkataon po, yung pinili nilang lugar, doon po nagsasalpukan ang dalawang currents ng Manila Bay. So ang pag mga ganitong lugar po, mas madali talaga siyang ma-erode.
Gumamit daw sila ng geotube.
Ano yun? No?
Yung geotube technology to prevent soil erosion.
Ginagamit din po yun sa ibang lugar, usually sa harbor areas.
Yes.
Kasi ang harbors po, unnaturally din pinapalalim para makapasok ang mga malalaking barko. So natural po yun napupuno parate. Umuustos talaga yung tinanggal nilang lupa. Kaya nilalagyan po ng ganun. So, ang problema ko lang po doon, kung ang gusto nyo ay beautification, parang counter kasi yun, hindi siya magandang tignan. Pero kung ang gusto nila ay harbor na malalim, tama po yun na ilagay doon kasi harbor naman siya.
Professor, there's another issue of concern ngayon actually, bigger than that. Yung binabalak ngayon ng Cavite, you mentioned Cavite, they're planning a major reclamation project around Sangli. Mas malaki pa daw yun sa buong city of Manila. Kung matutuloy yun, if it will be approved by the city government, anong impact nun sa ecosystem sa Manila Bay?
Especially po sa Cavite, it's very crucial to actually study kung saan yun gagawin. Kasi isa yun po sa natitirang nursery ground ng mga isda sa Manila Bay, sa Cavite area. So sana kung saan nila gagawin, hindi ma-impact yung nursery na yun.
Okay. Professor, before we let you go, I do want to ask, because the larger question here is, of course, people have made a lot with Yusek Antipordas calling UP MSI bayaran. And of course, he has apologized. We have to emphasize that. And you've accepted the apology. Pero hindi lang po yan yung bangayan ng gobyerno at saka ng UP at saka academics at saka mga researchers. We've had notorious controversial statements before from Senator Villar, for example, saying, ano ba itong gastos tayo ng gastos sa research. Pagkatapos ngayon, si spokesman Harry Roque, nasa issue rin for trying to tell Okta Research, huwag ka naman kayo masyadong maingay, inuunahan nyo ang gobyerno. As an academic, I just want to ask, kamusta po ang relasyon and what do you see of government's understanding, appreciation, and investment in research in this country?
In investment for research, it's actually much improved. No? So we do get, all of us, the academics, do get funding for research that is needed by the country. Siguro na lang ang kulang po is the connect of turning the research output into policy and actually going all the way into implementation. Doon po may mga gaps tayo. Actually, up to policy, okay na rin eh. It's the policy to implementation that still needs work. But I think we'll get there. Nakikita naman natin sa neighbors natin, those countries that have linked science to industry, science to government, like South Korea, for example, Japan, and so on. Nakita natin yung increase nila ng GDP, na better way of life, and so on. And I think, doon naman tayo. I would like to emphasize, Filipinos in general are scientific. If you ask kids, would they want to watch National Geographic or something like that?
Yes.
Excited sila. No? They're very hungry for science. Kakaroon lang po ng gap eventually kasi I guess we're not portrayed sexy. Unlike doctors or engineers or businessmen, no? Hindi nakikita yung final value ng pagiging scientist. And I think that gap will eventually be bridged. And that's my hope.
Okay. UP Marine Science Institute Director Dr. Laura David, maraming salamat po for joining us.
Salamat
Thank
po.
you, ma'am.
Thank you po.
Salamat po.
And before we go to break, we'd just like to note that we did try to reach out to Yusek Antiporda of the DNR for his comments. He declined invites for an appearance this evening. He has accepted invitations in the past. On that note, in an interview with Jay Taruk on 1PH1 Balita Pilipinas, he did reiterate his apology on this matter. And he had this to say on calls for him to resign.
Yusek Antiporda, marami pong mga kampo o mga sektor na hinihiling ang inyong pagbibitiw. Kayo ho ba ay magre-resign?
Hindi ko po sila papatulan and I will not answer that. So it's their prerogative. Humiling po sila na humiling kung gusto nila, it's their prerogative. Po. Ang akin po, ito sa MSI ang sinasabi ko, well, nagkausap na rin po kami ng MSI since nag-open po sila ng pinto nila at nagsabi na handa naman sila makipagtulungan.
Okay, that was DNR Yusek Benny Antiporda. We'll need to go for a break. Please stay with us. The Chiefs will be right back.
Okay. Gordon, ano? Welcome back to the Chiefs. We're now in the final stage of our conversation. And now joining us is Marikina City Representative Stella QUIMBO. Good evening, Congresswoman. Welcome back to the Chiefs.
Hello, good evening, Emily.
Good evening.
Robbie,
Good evening, ma'am.
Good evening.
Good evening.
Hindi ba overtime ngayon, Congresswoman? Sabi sa amin, marathon daw. We
Opo.
interviewed Congressman Congressman Mikey Romero last night. Gabing-gabi na nandun pa siya So,
Opo,
kaya natin tapos yung budget tomorrow as everyone is expecting? Yeah.
Kaya po. Kasi tonight po, we expect to end by midnight.
Yes.
So tomorrow po, palagay ko by late afternoon or early evening, dapat tapos na po. Well, that's my guess.
Wow.
Base po sa agenda.
Okay. So, ano po yung mga major or significant changes from the one that was passed in the original second reading? Saka ngayon, ano na so far?
Actually po, ang mga amendments na aasahan natin tomorrow upon approval po on second and third reading is hindi pa po yung mga major amendments. So tomorrow lang po yung mga errata kung tawagin. Kasi po magkakaroon pa po ng tinatawag na small committee which will collate po the what they call institutional amendments. So yun po naman ay i-incorporate doon po sa printed version which will be transmitted to the Senate. So ganun po yung sistema po natin pagdating sa budget.
So yung errata, yung errata yan ba yung mga inequitable appropriations of certain congressmen? Yung ba yun?
Ang tingin ko po ay hindi pa yan ma-address tomorrow. So tomorrow po, in other words, would be like the minor amendments. So, pero yung pong pag-address ng inequities which will require additional funds. Kasi tandaan po natin, yung amount ng budget is fixed, 4.506. So in other words, if you're going to add, for example, to a district na halimbawa po nalugi, In other words, napakakaunti po ng natanggap po na funds ang isang district. In order to add to that, you'll have to bawas somewhere. Dagdag bawas po yan dapat kasi because the budget amount is fixed. So,
Yes.
yung ganun po really requires more work na yan po ay ginagawa ng tinatawag po na small committee.
Okay, so kakasya ho ba yan na hanggang sa deadline ninyo ng pagpasa on third and final reading, considering na naka-recess na kayo after tomorrow?
So tomorrow po, pag ma-incorporate po yung tinatawag na errata, after that po, yung small committee will be authorized to do the amendments even after the approval on third reading. In other words, magtatrabaho po ang small committee even after tomorrow. Kasi po, kailangan nga mag-introduce nitong more major amendments doon po sa printed version to be transmitted to the Senate.
I mean, Congresswoman, itong small committee, is this essentially are we getting to the same point that former Speaker Alan Peter Cayetano tried to leave the process by when he formed the committee nung sinuspend? I mean, have we essentially gotten back to that same point?
Yes, kasi Robbie, every year naman talaga merong small committee. So that's a regular procedure. And so kasi ang hirap po niyan, there are 300 Congress people. So if every single one stands up and proposes an amendment for his or her district or marginalized sector, hindi po tayo matatapos. Kailangan po natin ng isang taon para lang mag-approve ng budget. So ang in-introduce at a certain point is the creation of a small committee na sila po ay authorized by the body to do these kinds of amendments. So yan ang inaasahan natin gagawin ng small committee to correct inequities.
Okay, but prior to when former Speaker Cayetano formed that committee, he named the members of that committee. Pareho po ba ang members ng committee or nag-iba na ang mga uupo dyan ngayon?
Robbie, if ever magkakaroon po ng changes dyan sa membership ng small committee, malalaman po natin tomorrow.
I see.
Ano po yung mga major items na dapat talakayin ng small committee? What are the stickiest issues, kumbaga?
Halimbawa po, let me give you an example. Si Congressman Wes Gatchalian, who chairs po the Trade and Industry Committee, early on he filed a resolution to increase the budget of the Department of Trade and Industry by 5 billion pesos. Kasi ang nangyari po sa proposed budget ng DTI is instead na tumaas, ay bumaba pa siya ng halos 1 billion, which is no one can understand why that happens. Ang constituency ng DTI, MSMEs. Napakarami pong MSMEs na nagsara. Napakaraming nawalan ng trabaho. So ito talaga yung kailangan ng ayuda. Yung magpapautang ka or capacity building for purposes of retooling, retraining, moving to the better normal, shifting from regular platforms to online platforms. Yan po ang trabaho ng DTI. So, nagtataka po kami kung bakit imbis na dapat po dyan, kung hindi nga pwedeng, dapat nga tripling nga yan di ba? So, ang nangyari po, bumaba pa siya ng 1 billion. So,
but Congresswoman, if you don't mind, gusto ko lang sundutin yon. Because that is the same question of everyone. Now, you're all in Congress, siguro naman may sagot doon. Hindi lang naman siguro kayo nagtataka. Paano nga nangyari yon? How did that happen? When something is so glaring to you, at what point in the process did that happen?
Doon po yan sa NEP. NEP is a National Expenditure Program which is proposed by the executive. And that is submitted to Congress right after the SONA. And ito naman po, as soon as Congress takes up the NEP, it becomes the General Appropriations Bill on first reading. So yun, nagiging GAB po siya. So yung laman po ng GAB is exactly the same as the NEP, which is proposed by the executive. So hindi po namin kasalanan kung bakit lumiit ang budget ng DTI dito sa GAB. Kaya nga po, nandito ang Kongreso para dinggin ang GAB. Because kung meron kaming makita mga bagay na kailangan makorek, point out po namin yan.
Halimbawa, yan nga pong pinoint out ninyo na example, hindi po ba yan nahuli nila ex-Speaker Cayetano nung pinasa nila on second reading yung budget? Hindi po yan na-correct noon pa lang?
So again po, that's the reason for why, this is just my opinion ha, kasi just trying to interpret kung ano yung
Yeah.
ibig sabihin ng ginawa niya is, kaya po siya nag-form ng small committee. Kasi again, the small committee takes charge of collating all proposed amendments by the members. And obviously, if I were Kong West Gatchalian, siguro po, yan po ay aking isusulong dito po sa small committee. Kasi nga, nag-file ako ng House resolution.
Congresswoman, last night you were tackling, the House was tackling the budget of the PWH na-criticize ni Senator Ping Lacson dahil dami-dami daw ng yung mga infra na dapat napunta sa ibang kumusta yung final kasi medyo late na kagabi, hindi na nahabol Anong kinahinat na ng DPWH budget? May mga tinanggal, may mga inayos ba yung mga inaalala ng mga senators about even the president mentioned it actually na masyado na maraming corruption dyan. Anong kinahinat na ng budget kagabi?
So, Ami, ulitin ko po na sa period of debate pa lang po kami sa second reading. So in other words, ito yung panahon na magtatanong ang isang kongresista sa mga bagay na sa tingin niyang halimbawa dapat i-rectify. Pero hindi pa talaga panahon pa para mag-propose ng amendments. And again, kung meron talagang mga gustong ibago, doon po isasubmit po yan sa small committee.
But you're
So,
saying
you're
saying you're on track to meet the deadline bukas? So ano exactly
Tama
yung
po.
meet
Tama
bukas? Kasi may sinabi din naman ni Tito Sen, si Senate President Tito Soto, baka daw November 5 niyo pa may bigay sa kanila yung budget, which means baka daw magka-reenacted budget kung ganong ka-late yun. Tama ba yung nakuha niyang impormasyon na yon?
Sa aking narinig, ang November 5 po is the deadline for the printed copy to be transmitted to the Senate. Kasi po remember, printed copy. So it takes time to encode and to print. Diba? Kasi that's a constitutional requirement. Kaya nga ang isang tanong dyan is, hindi ba dapat yung digital print is considered print? Pero yan po ay hindi pa natatakal, but actually tingin ko eventually dapat ganon. But okay, having said that, it takes time to do that. So ngayon ay October 15, diba? So kung meron ka halimbawa isang linggo to print and maybe say 5 days to encode, talagang ang November 5 po is talagang that's the tightest schedule po. But having said that, historically daw, tandaan niyo po, I'm a neophyte, so this is just my second budget hearing. But again, from what I heard, kapag dumating sa Senado ang printed copy on November 5, normally daw po, hindi naman po marire-enact. In other words, kaya daw dun sa period of time, obviously, before the end of the year na ma-approve po sa Senado.
So far, ma'am, are you seeing any impact arising from the political row that you have just been through, no? In terms of, for example, making revisions to the budget based on the positions of the opposing camps before? In short, meron bang objection na marami dun sa ipinasa na budget on second reading?
Well, tandaan po natin, no, dahil nga po nagkaroon ng malaking debate nga dito po sa speakership, ang naging malaking issue po dyan yung equity, yung inequitable distribution nga po of resources or perceived inequity, no, across districts. Yes. Kaya po ang ating bagong speaker, si Speaker Lord Velasco, talagang he's taking that to heart at kitang-kita mo naman po na he's doing everything that he can para po makorek po ang inequities. So right now po, again, being in the period of debate, yan po ang aming pong sinisigurado ano ba yung mga nature at ano yung magnitude po of equities. Para sa pagdating ng proper time, handa po kami mag-propose ng amendments.
Sabi niyo nga
to be
po,
more specific,
yung
yung kay Congressman Teves, Kasi yun ang napakainit. Galit na galit siya dun sa 11 billion na allocation daw ng CAMSUR. Samantalang sila raw, pati Taguig, no? Samantalang sila raw sa Negros ay kapraso lang, I think, 3 billion. Halimbawa yun, na-address na po ba yun?
So again, babalik ako sa proseso, hindi pa panahon. Kasi ganun po, very
hindi pa,
structured
okay.
po. Very structured po talaga kami sa Congress or sa period of debate, after that period of amendments. Pero pagdating nga sa budget, medyo may pagka-idiosyncratic ng kaunti because nga of that limitation na may printing na magaganap. And 3 volumes po yan eh. So as a result of that, the amendments happen after the approval on third reading. So and it goes through the small committee. So doon po natin malalaman.
Doon ma-resolve yun.
Sa printed copy po natin makikita kung paano po na-address ang inequities.
Okay, so I just want to repeat that, no? Yung na-address, yung inequities, may premise doon, di ba? But at the same time, you did say, no, the operative word is perceived. There is that perceived of inequity. I just wanted to ask, based on what you've seen so far, where do you stand on that perception? Is it a legitimate perception that there was inequitable distribution?
Alam mo, Robbie, it's very difficult to make a judgment just from a single observation, which is your own district. And remember, napakarami pong distrito kasi we're 300 Congress people. So, wala na po akong panahon para busisihin ang allocations ng bawat isa because everyone, hindi lang naman po single item po yan. Because you're talking about X number of roads, halimbawa, classrooms, things like those, right? So, normally, you just look at your own district. And of course, ang isang basehan mo dyan is, am I worse off today than last year? Diba? So, yun ang ating consideration. And ako, from where I stand, sa tingin ko po, I'm not worse off. So, ako, personally, pag tanungin mo ako,
Yan, sa inyo.
hindi ko po siguro masasabi yung nasabi ni Kong Teves about his own district. Diba? But I'm not saying na, hindi ko sinasabi na mali yung sinasabi ni Kong Teves. So, sinasabi ko na magkaiba kaming sitwasyon. And so, yan, kaya kailangan po ng small committee. Kasi kailangan mo talaga ng isang grupo na mag-judge nga. Diba? And so yun, titignan mo yung intertemporal equity. Ano yung difference ng situation mo before and after. Titignan mo rin yung vertical equity, ibig sabihin, if you're needier, of course, you would need more resources, di ba? Or
Which everyone is.
Yes, or maybe horizontal equity. Ibig sabihin, pag meron ako nakitang distrito na more or less, pareha kaming population size, land area, etc., dapat more or less similar ang budget namin. Di ba? So, yun ganun ang pagtingin po ng equity sa budget. So,
yeah,
it
unfortunately,
requires a group.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but unfortunately, I mean, I'm just trying to think the way a lot of people looking in are trying to make sense of it. But unfortunately, one reality there also, the politics never ends. So, for example, there's a small committee that then becomes a very powerful committee, which is and so how does that, even just composing the members of that committee, how are things put in place to make sure that that's a fair committee to start with? Because that was also part of the issues that the new speaker had with the former speaker.
Okay, 2 points. First is, may majority representation, may minority representation. The reason for why nakasama ako sa small committee is because I was chosen to represent the minority. So that's the first point. Second point is, typically po, ang leadership ang nandyan. And leadership po, meaning the leadership positions are distributed by party size. So, kapag ikaw ay miyembro ng malaking
Malaking
partido, ibig sabihin, baka dalawa ang representatives mo dyan. In which case, yun yung equity, di ba? May equity ka sa membership on the basis of making sure that you have majority and minority representation at the same time, party representation.
Okay. Okay, everybody's now fearing a reenacted budget, no? First question is, what do you think are the chances that that's going to happen? And second question is, what would be the worst case scenario if the budget were reenacted on top of the IMF's forecast of an 8.3% contraction in GDP next year?
Okay, do we start with the good news or the bad news? Okay,
Bad news muna.
bad news.
Parawi.
Okay. Napakalaking bad news kung mariinak ang budget. Because ang ibig sabihin niyan, ang magagastos mo lang would be personnel services as well as MOOE. So ang capital outlay mo, which would include your infrastructure projects, which has a very big multiplier effect. Sa lahat ng government spending, ang pinaka-productive in terms of job creation would be capital outlay, meaning the infrastructure projects. Mawawala lahat yon, and that's about 1.1 trillion pesos. So that's about a fourth of your budget. That's about 6% of GDP. So you will have to forgo opportunities to recover. Yan ang talagang major. Number two, ang 2020 budget is a pre-COVID budget. In other words, wala diyang budget items for COVID vaccines. Wala diyang budget for PPEs. Wala diyang budget for isolation facilities. Wala diyang budget for risk hazard allowance for frontliners. So disastrous po kung ma-reenact because hindi ka talaga makakapag talaga ng sufficient resources for a proper COVID health response. At sa aking computation, 67 billion pesos worth of COVID response ang mawawala kung ma-reenact. That's just the COVID response, ha? Wala pa dyan yung sinasabi kong 1 trillion pesos na ma-forgo na large multiplier effect projects, di ba? Tulad ng infrastructure. So ang good news naman, no, is that dahil kahit paano naman po, no, alam ko pong naging magulo ng kaunti ang buhay namin sa Congress, but thankfully
Medyo lang naman, medyo lang.
Konti lang, slight lang, di ba? Slight. But thankfully, as I mentioned earlier, mapapasa po ang budget bukas. So, hindi po ma-reenact. At yan naman po, I think, paulit-ulit naman pong promise naman po yan ni Speaker Lord, that will not happen po. And naniniwala po kami sa kanya.
Eto, I mean, serious question. I don't mean to sound like we're trying to build up somebody here, but kung maipasa bukas, does the new speaker get credit for that? I mean, for what he had to, because on the one hand, you get the impression that, look, he had to put things in place. On the other hand, we also get the impression that there are enough mechanisms within Congress, enough protocols, enough formulas for those things to fall in place anyway, and it can happen. And I ask this because, in fairness also to the new speaker, the former speaker and his allies were saying, alam nyo, pagka nagpalit tayo ng speaker, itong papalit, hindi nag-aaral, hindi nag-a-attend, tamad yan. Pagkatapos papasok siya, wala siyang alam sa budget. So, what's the fair thing to say? Kung maipasa bukas, does he deserve credit, or did Congress basically just fall on its systems?
Actually, you have to hand it to Speaker Lord, no? Itong last 4 days, so from Tuesday up to tomorrow, so that's 4 days of work. And that's 10 in the morning up to, kanina po, up to 4:30 in the morning. At araw-araw po yan for 4 days. And ang na-deliberate po na budgets would be the crucial ones. Nandiyan po ang DPWH, DOH. Ongoing pa rin po, no? So, yung mga crucial budgets talaga, kasi typically po, like katulad ng DOH, early on, na-schedule na yan. Kaya lang dahil napakaraming problema, na-defer ang approval. Kaya nung nagkaroon ng tila premature termination po, talagang medyo nabitin po kami ng kaunti. Kasi nga po yung mga crucial na mga budgets ay talagang marami pa po kami talagang concern sana na i-raise. Like ako po kanina, when I interpolated the DOH, sabi ko, bakit 13 billion lang ang nilagay nyo for COVID response? Napakaliit nun, considering that for the entire 2020, 82 billion na ang gagastusin natin just for 2020. Eh hindi naman dadating ang bakuna sa Enero, dadating ang bakuna baka 3rd or 4th quarter of 2020. So dapat, ang proper na preparation is for the full year, 12 months. So bakit 82 billion for 2020 and then ngayon, pagdating ng 2021, 13 na lang, diba? So, can you imagine?
Ano sinagot nila?
kung hindi ni-reopen ang budget hearings, hindi natin matatanong yan. Di ba?
Ano po ang DOH?
Ang sagot nila is kasi ang budget call, ayan, may validity pero parang pasang-awa, is because the budget call happens February or March. So at that time,
so
nobody
hindi pa
anticipated na talagang magiging ganito kahaba ang pandemya. So okay, pero in my head, it's an ongoing process naman. Hindi naman just because you submitted something in March doesn't mean you can turn in another memo and it's very important, right? So,
Right.
yun ang medyo head-scratching mo. Pero syempre, ang week...
Yes,
Ma'am,
ma'am,
ko lang
tanong ko
yung
lang
example
po
niya
yung
because I really like the example because all of a sudden something crystallized there. I mean, certainly for me. But when you cite that example and sinabi nyo nga, that's an example of something na kung natuloy yung suspension, we would not have been able to ask about that. That would not have even come up in the small committee?
Hard to say, but again, it takes, alam nyo, it's an interesting exercise. If you have not covered budget hearings, it's interesting kasi ang dami mo talaga matutunan dahil sa isang ahensya, ilan ang tatayo? 20 para magtanong. At minamaximize yung 30 minutes na yan. At kami po, nag-aaral naman po kami bago kami tumayo. Nakakahiya na tatayo ka doon at di mo alam kung itatanong mo. So, makikita mo talaga na iba-iba ang lalabas na concerns. So, ang kagandahan with 300 people to represent various districts, ganun karaming punto de vista ang lumalabas, di ba? Kaya nasusuyod talaga.
Actually, ma'am, yung punto de vista po ninyo kanina sa mga hearing ay yung tinawag ninyong transport inflation, kung saan itinutulak ninyo ang pagpayag na ilabas na lahat ng mga jeep, no, in particular. Pakipaliwanag nyo nga ang kahalagahan ng inyong pinaninindigan na yan. Ano ba yung transport inflation and why we need to open up the roads now to more jeepneys instead of restricting them?
So yung inflation is just a measure of pagtaas ng presyo. No? So pag sinasabing may inflation ka ng 3%, ibig sabihin tumataas ang presyo mo by 3%. So yung dating 100 pesos, ngayon 103 na. So yun ang inflation. And we compute that for the entire economy. Ibig sabihin for a basket of goods. But yung inflation na yan ay pwede mo makompute for certain sectors. So ang inflation natin for the entire economy is 2.6%, which is very good. Kasi ang target natin is 3%. Every year yan, every time BSP monitors inflation, talagang 3% ang kanilang threshold.
Right.
So 2.6 very good. But if you
Yes.
look at the transportation sector, it's 8.3% for this quarter.
Paano ho nangyari yon dahil hindi naman nagtataas ng pamasahe? Yun ang
Correct.
sinasabi. No?
Correct.
Oh.
So ibig
Paano
sabihin
nangyari?
nun, kahit na hindi nagtataas ng fares, tumataas yung total expenses. Ibig sabihin, kung dati halimbawa, sumasakay ka ng isang tricycle, isang jeep, nandun ka na sa sa pabrika halimbawa. Ngayon, since walang jeep, sasakay ka halimbawa ng isang tricycle, pero ang haba-haba ng itatakbo ng tricycle mo.
So mahal.
At 'di ba ngayon, syempre kailangan mag-isa ka sa tricycle. So, dahil special na, tapos mahaba pa yung distance, di yung binabayad mo ngayon is way more than
Yes.
what you used to
Right.
pay. So, yun yung, ang dami-dami na naming hearings with DOTR and LTFRB since March. And every single time kita kami, eto ang tinatanong ko. Eto talaga. Parang hindi nyo ba nare-realize na ang effect niyan is tataas yung spending. And therefore, ipapasada nyo na yung jeeps. And they would always promise me, sige, papayagan namin, hinihingi pa sa akin yung, ano ba mga rota dyan sa Marikina, binibigay ko naman. Hanggat sa ngayon, talagang wala pa rin. So, napagod na ako, di ba, sa kakahintay at in-explain ko na, ito na talaga yon, di ba? Tumataas ang presyo means only one thing, may shortage. So, pag tinatanong ko, di ba, sa kahit anong bagay, pag may shortage, pag mas marami, nanggigigil ang mga buyers relative to the supply, tumataas ang presyo. Diba? So,
anong paliwanag nila? Yes.
They kept
Anong paliwanag nila?
They kept saying, hindi sufficient. Sabi ko, hindi nga eh. The fact na you have extraordinary price increases means kulang. So, walang paliwanag.
Pero how do you factor in concerns about COVID transmission sa mass transport? Kasi yun naman ang kasi yun ang inaalala din ng yun ang one of the biggest considerations of the guys in charge of transportation.
Ang health.
Impact nun sa COVID transmission. Ano naman yung sabihin niyo sa kanila doon?
So actually, ang tamang dyan, approach, sa tingin ko, is you really need to subsidize. Kasi with social distancing, so kalahati na lang ang magiging revenues ng mga namamasada. Pero syempre, kung kalahati na lang ang revenues, hindi na viable, di ba? They'd rather not do this. They'd rather just maybe sell food, right? So, pero kailangan natin ng public transportation. So government has to step in and subsidize and make them viable. Yan ang ginawa namin sa Bayanihan too. That's why it's very frustrating. We set aside 5.58 billion pesos for service contracting. In other words, kukontratahin na ng gobyerno. Babayaran na yung buong biyahe mo for one day, di ba? So, in other words, that would ensure viability. And number two, kung kulang pa yan, meron pang fuel subsidies. So, we've provided 9.5 billion, I think, total under Bayanihan 2. So sure ako dun sa 5.58 for service contracting and another 2.6 billion for fuel subsidies at meron pang sobra for other things. So, and so I asked about that, right? Ano ba yung implementation guidelines nyo dyan? Wala pa. So sabi ko, September 15 yung effectivity ng Bayanihan 2. It's already October 15.
Congresswoman, I was reading a comment of an urban and mobility expert because we did interview a lot of people from DOTR saying, service contracting na rin kami. MMDA also said, naiintindihan na namin ng service contracting. But the point of the expert was basically saying, finally, we're hearing service contracting, but I have a sinking feeling that the executive doesn't understand what it means. Do you get that feeling also?
That's why, that was my point of questioning last night. Sabi ko, paki-explain sa akin para maintindihan ko. Kasi kung ako, ang understanding ko dyan is kukontratahin ng gobyerno, halimbawa, ang isang jeep. Ibig sabihin, so ang tanong ko dyan, kung ako nakatanggap niyan, sisingil pa ba ako sa pasahero ko?
Right.
Di ba dapat hindi na? Or,
yes, bayad ka na.
Kung ang bayad is kalahati lang, o sige, pwede kang maningil. Kasi anyway, reduced naman by half ang revenues mo. Hindi naman nila ako binigyan ng ganun detalye. So yun ang pagtatanong ko because I was curious to know. Ano ang konsepto ninyo ng service contracting? Unfortunately, hindi lumabas yan sa aking
interview. Okay, but in any case, for the mobility advocates watching here, can we get one thing clear? Okay, execution is one thing, implementation is one thing, and that's obviously a gap and that's lacking. But are you saying that policy-wise and even legislation-wise, it's already there? We're already headed towards a changing of the business model of public transport in the Philippines?
Absolutely. Since September 15, when we passed Bayanihan 2, it's there. It's crystal clear. The words service contracting, the words fuel subsidies, and other kinds of support. And precisely, because I was part of the bicameral committee, and precisely that was the deliberation. That was the purpose for it, because it's obvious that they will not be viable unless government supports them.
Okay, that's very reassuring. Thank you.
We've run out of time. Marikina Representative Stella QUIMBO, thank you for joining the Chiefs.
Thank you,
Congressman.
Maraming salamat po.
Maraming salamat.
Okay, we've run out of time, and that will be all for this special edition of the Chiefs. But we hope what was discussed here will keep the conversation going. I'm Ami Paminton of the Philippine Star.
I'm Luchi Cruz Valdez of News 5.
I'm Robbie Alampay, and we are One News.